All right. Bringing you home sounds like a big job, but at least I'd like to start by thanking the organizing committee again. You all have really organized a great conference and you've worked hard. We really appreciate it. I'm going to be talking today about discourse particles in Kimaragang. Kimaragang is an endangered Philippine type language in this corner. I don't know if you can see my cursor of northeastern Borneo, right about where the A is, the first A in Kinabalu. Turns out that Kimaragang has quite a collection of focus particles. I'm going to be concentrating mostly just on two of them today, no and po. When they have their focus meaning, these, which happens mostly in cleft sentences, they express exhaustive and non-exhaustive focus respectively. But they also have aspect meanings, which are similar to the meanings of na and pa in Tagalog and other Philippine languages. It's also similar to pairs of adverbials in a number of languages like still and already in English, or noch and schon in German, which have gotten just an enormous amount of attention. I'm going to assume that the po is pretty close to still. We can just treat it as meaning still. But noch, German, no in Kimaragang needs more attention. It is similar to already in some ways. I'm going to argue that the core meaning of the aspectual no is what Comrie referred to as the perfect of continuing result. And at the end of the talk, I'm going to offer just a couple of brief and very tentative ideas about how we might, I'm taking the aspect functions to be the primary senses of these particles. I'll offer a few thoughts on how we might derive the focus meanings from the aspect meanings. But I'd like to start, since again, these focus meanings mostly occur in cleft sentences, I want to start by looking at the structure, the nature of the cleft. And of course, Elena Paul has a good article about these constructions, which she points out really are pseudoclefts, but for simplicity, I'm just going to call them clefts, if that's okay. All right, standard way of looking at focus structure is the principle of question-answer congruity. So in a question like 1A, which person around here has a sharp mind? It's perfectly acceptable and quite natural to put the answer, the focus of the answer, in the clefted construction, like in 1B. It's gingiretai, they say, who's clever. It's not acceptable to put the answer to that question in a topic position, as in 1C. That's a perfectly fine sentence, but not in this context. It's not an acceptable answer. Conversely, the current topic of discussion cannot be clefted. So in a question like 2A, where'd you get that rattle? The gunding here, this rattle is the traditional brass rattle that the priestess uses when she goes into a ritual trance. So the question establishes the rattle, the gunding, as the topic of conversation, and it's perfectly natural to put the rattle in a topic position, like in 2B, but not acceptable to put it in the cleft position in 2C. So these kinds of tests show us that the clefted position is compatible with focus, incompatible with topics. It's what we expect. The cleft itself is, I mean, in terms of sentence structure, it's a pretty normal sentence. The predicate comes first. As Elena showed in her article, we have these, it's basically a null copula construction. You have these two noun phrases. And the first noun phrase is the predicate. The second noun phrase, is a headless relative clause functioning as the subject of the clause. And that this headless relative is an important part of making it a cleft. But in a lot of ways, these examples in 3 are just repeated from 1 and 2, the clefts that we saw before. In a lot of ways, it's the same structure as a normal nominal predicate type of sentence, like she's my sister or my son's fiance is a European, where the predicate phrase comes in the normal predicate initial position. But the difference is in these normal nominal predicate, simple nominal predicate sentences, there's no determiner. And so these noun phrases just name a predicate, whereas in the cleft, you have either an article, the case markers double as articles, or a demonstrative, which turns the predicate into a referring expression, right? It's an argument type instead of a predicate type. It's a definite referring expression, and therefore it has a specificational interpretation. Lena Mikkelsen points out in a BLS paper that she calls this I forget the exact term, but it's a puzzle that's been around for a long time. People have noticed for a long time that specificational copular clauses exhibit a fixed topic focus structure. Only the predicate noun phrase can be the focus. Unlike other copular constructions, there's something special. Well, of course, in Kimaragang, the predicate comes first, whereas in English, it's going to come last. But that's what we see here. The predicate of these cleft sentences is the focus. And as I mentioned, the articles, the case markers double as articles for common noun phrases, distinguishing forms for definite, indefinite, and unique reference. So either you'll get a definite or a unique reference marker for these cleft focused elements, the predicates. The focus construction itself is not highly marked, like the it cleft in English. It's used in more widely in more contexts. I think that's true in Tagalog and Indonesian as well. The cleft doesn't have this strongly marked quality as it does in English, but it also doesn't specify what kind of topic is involved. If you want to specify that, we can optionally add one of the focus particles. So the examples in 6 are just a few more examples of clefts without particles, which do have a focusing effect, but don't specify what kind of focus. But as I've said, if you add a particle, then you get more specific focus type interpretation. So the two we're interested in here, no and po. The first one is the exhaustive focus. It's wild pigs, no, that can crunch open a dry coconut with their teeth. That means it's wild pigs and only wild pigs. By the way, this is kanas here, bare noun functioning as a name for the species, so it's a natural kind term. It doesn't need the determiner to count as in a sense like a proper name. The inclusive or non-exhaustive focus, you po, be the one to swing the baby, because other people have been doing it before. So it's the opposite of the no, and we'll go into that a little more later. Just to illustrate what some of the other particles can do, we have nopo, which means only, giving you an exclusive focus reading. Nogi means all sorts of things, but inside a cleft, it gives you a counter expectation reading. It was the bush knife, nogi, that he used to dig out the banana stump. Unexpected because the bush knife's not the right tool for that job. It's too small. We have this clitic E, which doesn't occur in a cleft very often. It's normally a marker of something like virum focus or virum emphasis on normal predicates, but when it does occur in the cleft, it'll give you a contrastive type focus. You cut the rice stalks, I will be the one. Yoko I at palapos, I'll be the one to thresh it. And then with no, this general emphatic particle that shows up all over the place, this is a way of marking corrective focus, not me, but Jim, right? Yoko no, Jim no, sorry. Interestingly, all but this last one occur in the same position class. I added an appendix at the end of the handout. If you're interested, there's a chart that shows the ordering relationships among the second position clitics in Kimaragang. Won't take time to talk about that. Now let's look more closely at the exhaustive and non-exhaustive focus readings. Here's a minimal pair in 13A. Jim no is the one who stole your buffaloes, or Jim po is the one who stole your buffaloes. With no, it implies it was Jim and only Jim who was stealing the buffalo. With Jim po, it's saying that Jim was involved, but others might have been involved and others may have taken some buffalo too. And we can demonstrate the exhaustive nature of no by trying to add a continuation, like it's the wild pigs, no, that can crunch open these coconuts. And in fact, the rhinoceros can do it too, right? So that's unacceptable. It would be like saying it's only wild pigs who can do this, but the rhinoceros can too, right? There's a contradiction there. Interesting things happen under negation. First of all, because the predicate of this cleft is normally a noun phrase, sometimes a PP, but in either case, you can't use the standard negation, normal causal negation marker, but you have to use this nominal negation marker. Okon is cognate with bukan in Indonesian. So as in Indonesian, nominal predicates require bukan, whereas other verbal and adjectival predicates take the standard negation marker. But like bukan, well, let me talk about bukan. Bukan also functions with predicates of any type as a external negation or metalinguistic negation marker. And okon seems to have that same property. I'm assuming that the okon, when the cleft is being negated, it is a kind of metalinguistic negation. In any case, negation of the cleft with okon takes scope over these exhaustive or non-exhaustive elements of meaning, which is interesting partly because when no or po co-occur with normal standard negation, that's in their aspectual functions, then the aspect functions of no and po always take scope over negation. So if I say, I'm not happy, no, that means I was happy before, but I'm not happy now. The no takes scope over the negation. But with the okon, right, this external metalinguistic negation, that takes the scope. So what I'm negating in 15a is the uniqueness, the exhaustive reading. It wasn't Jim, no, means it wasn't only Jim. Jim might have been involved, he probably was involved, but he wasn't the only one. And with pa, what you're negating is the non-exhaustive, the inclusive reading. It wasn't Jim, pa means he wasn't involved, he didn't do it. When you express a negative clef, that's almost what you want to say. He didn't do it. So normally, the normal negative form of a cleft is going to involve this pa particle. And actually, back down in 17, I give you another example just to illustrate. It wasn't me who cut it, right? Just the normal way to express a negative cleft is going to have this pa particle involved. What 16 shows us is that our old example about the wild pigs crunching coconuts, now, if under negation, it wasn't the wild pigs, no, that can crunch coconuts. It isn't the wild pigs, no, it isn't only wild pigs who can crunch coconuts. The rhinoceros can do it too. Now that's fine. That continuation is perfectly acceptable. All right. One more point about negation. The existential presupposition, which is typically associated with a cleft, is preserved with or without a particle, regardless of what particle is there. So if you say it wasn't Jim who stole your buffaloes, with no or pa or no particle, doesn't matter, you can't then deny they weren't even stolen, right? There's something contradictory about that too. There's a presupposition that the event in fact did take place. Somebody did it. It doesn't seem to be very common across languages for languages to have a specific marker for non-exhaustive focus. One possible example apparently is in situ focus in Hungarian, but it's just not common. And one of the AFLA reviewers suggested that maybe what you're calling non-exhaustive focus is something like a contrastive topic. And that turns out to be a really interesting comparison. Both non-exhaustive focus and contrastive topic are offering a partial answer to the current question under discussion, but they offer it by different strategies. And I don't think I have time to talk about that now, but I added another appendix on the handout giving some examples of each type, contrastive topic type and the partial focus type. And if someone's interested, maybe we can talk about that during the question time. All right, now I want to talk about aspectual meanings of no and pa. These two particles are in opposition to each other in a range of contexts, and I've listed a few of the most common ones here. And I'm actually not even going to talk about the bottom three. I'm only going to talk about aspect and focus. As I said, I think pa we can more or less translate as still and just assume that's what it means. No, I think of no as a yamative, and that's a funny term. It was coined by this guy Olson in his MA thesis, and he describes it as a cover term for more or less grammaticalized markers that have functions shared by already and the perfect. I don't think the term has caught on. It hasn't gotten wide acceptance, partly because no one really knows how to spell it. I had a quarrel with David Gill at the ICAL conference in Madagascar a few years ago over the spelling of this word. And of course, David turned out to be right, and I don't hold that against him. But maybe a more serious problem is the fact that Olson never defines the term. He illustrates it by using some prototypical cases. I don't know whether the concept can be defined precisely enough to be useful, but I kind of think that the intuition, there's something right about the intuition. I think no is a prototypical example of what he was getting at. And I think he might also be right that these things are sort of an aerial feature of Southeast Asian languages. So Josina has co-authored a very good paper with Lisa Matthewson about the differences, how to distinguish already from perfect aspect. And I won't have time to go through point by point. I do address one of their points, again, in an appendix of the handout, which is the duality between no and pa with respect to negation. So in that respect, no is similar to already, but I'm going to argue that the core meaning of no, of its aspectual use, is best treated as what Comrie refers to as the perfect of continuing result. So here's the definitions that I'm proposing. Notice first the two particles differ in what de Swart calls their aspectual sensitivity, the selectional restrictions. Pa selects for atelic situations, no selects for telic situations, telic events. Pa means roughly still, so it asserts that the proposition is true at topic time and presupposes that was also true before topic time. It also seems to imply that the possibility of P being false or not, not P is somehow salient at the current time, whether that's a presupposition or an implicature. I'm going to list it here as a presupposition. All right, so what I'm saying about no basically is it describes a past event which has current relevance in Kami's terms. That's his general definition of perfect, but specifically it's a past event that had a result which is still currently true. The result state is true at topic time. In English, with English perfect, we can't even get the perfect of continuing result reading most of the time with an atelic predicate. What happens in Kimaragang is that you get coercion effects to turn the atelic predicate into some kind of telic interpretation. And the interpretations that arise are very, very similar to the Mandarin sentence final particle le. So Huiling has written a couple of great papers about the aspect uses of this sentence final particle. And they're very similar to what I see in Kimaragang. All right, so one of the most famous coercion effects is changing states into inchoatives or change of state. Asaweg is the basic state of existential, there's no water. When you add the na clitic, it becomes, we don't have any water now, but we did before. We've just run out of water. Right? It implies recency, but it means there has been a change. We used to have water and now we don't. Alolomo no ilaboli, the barrow has gotten fat. So the change of state reading requires, or strongly prefers to have the no particle there. That's in this context, without some special context, that reduplication really needs a comparison, and the most obvious comparison is the way it used to be. It's fatter now than it was before, but the change of state reading requires the no. Statements of ability and habitual action essentially are states, and so you get the same kind of change of state reading. He's able to see now, which he wasn't before in 24a, first line. Or my child goes to school now, which he didn't before. He started going to school by adding the no. Another kind of coercion effect that's found with activity predicates is the inceptive. So we can see that in the second line of 24a. His eyes are beginning to heal. It says literally they are healing already, or they're healing no. So they're beginning to heal. You get change of state. The event in the past was the beginning of the process that's going on, the continuing situation now. Another example, basic predicate dumaron, it's raining. When you add the no, oh, look, it started raining, right? This inceptive reading. And all of these are very similar to what you find with Mandarin sentence final le, including some of these others. Imminent occurrence. His wife gives birth, no, means she's about to give birth. And in the context might be, oh, quick, call the midwife, she's about to give birth. Oh, golly. Here's a line illustrating that the newly change of intention, right? I've decided to do X. This comes from I'm going to go ahead and do this anyway, taking some time. It's a creation myth about the rock formations on the top of Mount Kinabalu. And the story is a man named Majabo climbs up the mountain to bring back the soul of his dead wife. And he takes his bush knife and starts chopping on the rocks and threatening the guardian spirits until they finally agree. They have a change of heart. And this example is where they express that change of heart. They're speaking, they say, don't worry, go home now. We return your wife, no. We return your wife, we cause your wife to return already. Meaning we have decided to. It's not that they're doing it now, or not even necessarily imminent, but they've made the decision. Same thing happens in Chinese. It's very striking. All right. Why perfect? I think I'm about out of time, so let me rip through some of these. We can talk more later if you want. First of all, they're incompatible with adverbs of specific past time. In English, it's okay. So we can say his wife gave birth to a child, and we can specify the time, like last month, but not, in that case, you can't add the particle. If you have a description of a past event with the particle, he has slaughtered that buffalo, then you can't add the time phrase. Second, it implies current relevance in a sense. So in English, it's odd to say, when I was a small child, both my parents died. In Kimaragang, for the same reason, if you're describing that, you would use the simple past tense, but you would not add this particle. Third, it allows a relative past tense or pluperfect interpretation. Mother's corpse had already been shrouded by the time we arrived. The had been shrouded, past in the past, requires the na particle to make that work. So these are all common features of perfects in English and other languages. All right, now I'm out of time, which is probably a good thing because I don't have a whole lot to say here. I have just a vague idea. How do we get, if I'm right that the aspect meaning is the basic sense of these particles, how do we get their focus meaning? The key idea is that when you combine one of these aspect particles with a definite description, a definite referring expression, you can't get the kinds of aspectual coercion effects that I was just talking about. You can't get a change of state, you know. Sandy Chung is Sandy Chung, and in most contexts, to think about her changing her identity, that you know that there's ways to do that, but it's not the same thing as changing, you know, we're out of water to a change of state. So it's the nature of the predicate in the clefts that blocks the aspectual coercion. And I'm suggesting that what happens instead is a kind of pragmatic coercion that interprets these particles as something like an utterance modifier. So no would mark the utterance. Well, okay, what kind of utterance, what kind of speech act is being performed? The focus structure of the cleft marks it as being an answer to the current question under discussion. All right, so to affect the focus structure of the cleft reflects what the current question under discussion is. No then marks this speech act, this answer to the question, as tilik, something like an accomplishment. And it culminates. By virtue of making the current utterance, I have provided the answer to the current question under discussion, and the next turn in the conversation can go on to a different question. Pa indicates that the current speech act is atilik in a sense. It's more like an activity. By making this utterance, I am answering the question, but I'm not implying culmination. I'm not saying it has been answered. So that's pretty vague. Interestingly, again, there's a parallel with Mandarin le. In the Lee and Thompson reference grammar, they list 5 different uses of the sentence final particle. The aspectual one that I mentioned, plus 4 others. And the last one they talk about is what they call a mark of finality, that speakers use it as indicating that this is the speaker's total contribution to the conversation as of that moment. I mean, this is my contribution. I'm done. And it's sometimes used at the end of a story to mark, okay, the story's over. So in a sense, in Mandarin, the sentence final le is also marked as a way of as an utterance modifier. So, okay, this is all I have to say on this topic, period. I will stop there. If you have suggestions of how to make a better, you know, argument for deriving these focus meanings, I'd love to hear them. And of course, if you have questions, I'll give a try at answering those too. Thanks.
All right, thank you very, very much. We have around 6 minutes for questions. I guess Mitchell can go first.
Thank you. This is so stimulating as always, Paul. Comment and a quick question. The comment, because you like these Mandarin comparisons, is for Paul, in Mandarin too, I mean, like aspectual still high also has an additive use, yes. Right? So true, in addition type use, right? So, I mean, yeah. I think that's not accidental. And there's work also on different uses of, even English still, which has actually a range of different functions in addition to the aspectual one. So I think there might be something deeper there cross-linguistically too that is certainly interesting. A narrower question is, I wonder about no and po in WH questions. So assuming that those are also formed from these kind of pseudoclefts, what I wonder about is whether if you put po on a question, whether it would give it a mention some question reading where you're not expecting a complete answer anymore, but I just want to know at least one answer that satisfies this. Does that actually happen? Or I'd be interested in that.
That's a great question. I did some searching. I'll have to go back and look and see if I came up with some better examples. The one that sticks in my mind, the question word Isai for who. Isai no ma did so and so. So the ma is some I don't know, some expressive type marker. But in that case, the no it seems almost like just an emphatic marker. It is a cleft construction. The clefted element is the question word. But in that particular example, it's not clear. I couldn't tell from translation or anything whether it was expecting an exhaustive meaning or not, but it was clearly heightened emphasis in some way. The use of the particles in questions is a lot less frequent than in statement clefts, so they're a little harder to find, but that's a good thing. I should look at that.
Thank you.
All right, next up, Josina. Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, thanks, Paul, for a really interesting talk. I have more 2 pointers that may be really useful for continuing this. So Anna Krajinovic wrote a dissertation on Nafsan, and a large part, it's an oceanic language, and devoted to the perfect in this language, and which has similar functions. And then, but she also has a story of how to derive duality with the perfect, which I don't remember now, but she has that story. And then Lydia Mazzatelli wrote a manuscript on this marker asang, which has similar markers, which he uses the cover term yamative, which I also struggle with very much. We can discuss after. And then what she calls, she argues for a similar thing to what you're saying is like the discourse pragmaticalization towards these different functions. And some of the other functions that she talks about are contrastive focus, unexpectedness, and a change in scene and narratives. So those were the 2 comments that I had. I didn't have a question, but I agree with you that yamatives is not a good term, and I like how you define the using assertions and what it means to assert and presuppose for these markers.
Yeah, I'd like to get, maybe I'll talk to you later. I'd like to get those references. The different kinds of focus. In Kimaragang, we have different particles for some of the kinds of focus, but the last one you mentioned was something about the sequence of events in a narrative.
Mm-hmm.
That is one of the functions of no, and I've taken that as being different from this perfect of continuing result. In a narrative, the main events in a narrative sequence typically are expressed in the reduced form, what's sometimes called the dependent form in Philippine languages. It looks like an imperative. It's the same form used for an imperative, actually, and then generally marked with no as well. So you have it's like a narrative tense marker, where po in narrative marks you do this first and only then do something else. The one that comes first is marked with po.
Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting.
All right, next Dan Kaufman.
Oh, thanks. I apologize for asking so many questions at this conference. I've thought about this quite a bit for Philippine languages, and I termed it at one point, I think, kind of external aspect. What the idea was that, so okay, like tense is all about speech time, an aspect, inner aspect or regular aspect is about event time, but this external aspect or yamatives bring in this dimension of hearer or maybe discourse expectation. Yes. And at least for the Philippine cases, I felt like all of what ties it together is that na or no really means before hearer expectation, and power po is after expectation, which I think to a large extent is what already and still do. But for some reason in these languages, these markers are almost obligatory in many contexts, where already and still are, I can't really think of many contexts that require them. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, and no definitely carries a sense of expectation. I found one example where I had elicited now 15 years ago or something. The sentence is something like, he is going to kill the buffalo. If you have no, it gets this imminent event interpretation, coerced, he's about to kill the buffalo, but it implies it's been expected. So with no, you have to have a definite if form. But if you say he's going to kill a buffalo, indefinite, then you can't put the no there. So part of the issue is exactly what you're talking about, this sense of expectation that comes along with no, at least in some contexts.
Thanks.
All right, thank you. Please join me again in thanking Paul for his talk.